As the field of Democratic candidates for president grows, so too does the map of states they are visiting. Lisa Desjardins takes a look.
Today in Pittsburgh, former Vice President Joe Biden's first speech as a current presidential candidate.
The country wasn't built by Wall Street bankers. It was built by you. It was built by the great American middle class.
Choosing his native Pennsylvania, Biden aimed to show he can win with frustrated swing voters.
If I'm going to be able to beat Donald Trump in 2020, it's going to happen here. It's going to happen here.
Biden's 2020 Democratic rivals have spent little time in Pennsylvania so far, but in Nevada this weekend, a handful of Democrats made similar overtures to working-class voters at a union conference in Las Vegas.
We must get a $15 minimum wage.
Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar.
We're strongest when we stand together.
Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren.
The concerted attacks on organized labor.
Also there, California Senator Kamala Harris and former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke. This weekend, O'Rourke also unveiled a 10-year, $5 trillion climate change plan that aims to get the U.S. to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. His plan uses an initial government investment to spark private spending. Meantime, New Jersey Senator Cory Booker took his Justice for All tour, focused on criminal justice reform, to Florida. Booker's pushing to expand voting rights for felons, something Florida voters approved last year, and some in the state legislature are trying to limit.
Joe's a lot like our firefighter.
But in the endorsement race, Biden scored his first big win, the endorsement of the International Association of Firefighters.
He's one of the staunchest advocates for working families.
Biden is zeroing in on a key set of 2020 battlegrounds, seeking to rebuild the so-called Blue Wall, states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, home to many white working-class voters. Biden and President Obama won those three states, both in 2008 and 2012. But in 2016, President Trump flipped them red. And Mr. Trump is fighting to keep that block. Over the weekend, Mr. Trump held a rally in Green Bay, Wisconsin. He told the manufacturing state that the Japanese prime minister privately pledged to invest billions in new car factories.
They're coming back. They want to be back to Ohio, to Pennsylvania.
And today on Twitter, Mr. Trump criticized Biden's inaugural speech in Pennsylvania and said his policies have helped the state, especially its steel industry. As the two men spar over Pennsylvania voters, Biden's visit today is likely the first of many visits to the state by both the former vice president and current president. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Lisa Desjardins.
Senator Cory Booker is one of 20 Democrats competing for his party's presidential nomination. He just wrapped up his 2-week-long Justice for All tour, and he joins us now. Senator Booker, welcome to the NewsHour.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here with you.
So, as we said, you're one of 20. I think it's fair to say a number of voters out there are overwhelmed. They're trying to understand how is one candidate different from another. As they look at you, how do they think Cory Booker is different from any of the other candidates?
Well, I think there's two things that distinguish me. One is just a very different career than the others in the race. I was a chief executive of my state's largest city through a crisis, and we actually created probably one of the best city comebacks in a decade, a city known for crime and corruption, now going through its biggest expansion economically. It's going through its biggest transformation of its school system and more. And then on top of that, I am a United States Senator that has a reputation in Washington for getting things done. In fact, the only piece of major bipartisan legislation that passed under this president was legislation I led in the Senate on the Democratic side with Dick Durbin for criminal justice reform. So getting things done in two different environments, as chief executive and as a legislature, I think points to what kind of leader I'll be. But then the last thing is really important. I think there's a lot of folks who believe that this is a time that Democrats have to fight fire with fire. As a guy who ran a fire department, that's not a really good strategy. Democrats need to define themselves not what they're against, or who they're against, but we've got to define ourselves what we're for. And this is a time where our nation needs a revival of civic grace, and it needs us to call us to our higher angels, not the low road of fighting Donald Trump on his own turf and his own terms.
Well, speaking of what you are for, one of the things you've talked about in your what you're calling your Justice for All tour is expanding the earned income tax credit. This is something that was originally conceived to help the working poor. You're talking about greatly expanding it so that couples earning as much as $90,000 a year would be eligible. The question is, it would cost $2.5 trillion over a period of years. Are you undermining the original purpose of it, which is to help the working poor?
Well, I don't think so. I think families often making dual income, people making under $90,000 a year, are feeling the squeeze as everything, the cost of everything is going up, from prescription drugs to child care. We have this nation now where baby boomers, 95% of them did better than their parents. For millennials, it's now down to 50%. We have a nation that could see the first generation not to do better than the one before. And a lot of that is because we're at a time of corporate profits are at 85-year high, but wages are about a 60-year low. And instead of this bank shot of sending tax cuts like we just did, blowing trillions of dollars of holes in our deficits, and thinking that somehow that's going to trickle down to working people, let's just give working Americans making $50,000 a year, $40,000 a year, or couples making twice that, more of a direct return on their taxes.
But as we said, this would cost $2.5 trillion. You've said that over a decade. You also want to raise the minimum wage. You want to see that raised $15 an hour. You've got other Democrats. Senator Warren wants a virtually free public college. He's talked about a federal daycare program. Beto O'Rourke is talking about a $5 trillion climate change plan, and on and on. A lot of this is popular, but voters are going to be asking, how do we pay for it?
Well, I can show you how to pay for it. I can't speak to other folks, but the pay fors for me are very obvious. Number one, you can start taxing capital gains as ordinary income. If a wealthy person buys a Picasso, sells it for $1 million, sells it for $10 million, they're paying less of that than somebody who goes out and sweats for their job as a janitor or in a factory. They should be taxed at the same rate. That alone is going to bring in well over $1 trillion more. Rolling back these toxic Trump tax cuts at the highest marginal incomes, moving back the capital gains tax to where it was in the crazy wild days of the Obama era can bring in over $1 trillion. We can do things that we used to do in my grandparents' generation that expanded the middle class, making strategic investments and having a tax rate that is fair in terms of not blowing holes in our deficit, but actually creating more growth for everyone.
But is there a simple Democratic message, though? You've got President Trump saying, look, and this is if the economy stays where it is right now, economy's continuing to grow, we've got full employment, stock market's roaring. What's the Democrats' simple to understand answer?
Well, you're going to have 20 different people telling you what that is. And my simple answer is that we are at a point in our society where the indices of success that we're using don't speak to the average American. The stock market ticker or GDP numbers don't speak to people in my community. I live in a working class community that's struggling at the poverty line, where people who work full-time jobs still at my corner bodega use food stamps. You think they care what the stock market's doing today or what the GDP numbers? No. Donald Trump seems to have the answer to folks who have wealth, and I'm not demonizing people with wealth, but why are we gearing our tax code to help people with wealth get more wealth? We put $750 billion in our tax code, moving wealth up. And some of those things I defend and think are okay, like the mortgage interest deduction. But why aren't we starting to do things to make sure that people who work every day in America can have the American dream? And that's the problem that we have right now. And there seems to be a lack of empathy. A more courageous empathy is needed in our country to see the struggles of people from factory towns to farm towns to city towns who can't even afford the rent in their cities anymore because costs are going so high.
You do favor the Medicare for All plan introduced by Senator Sanders. In essence, it's single payer. It would, within 4 years, do away with virtually all private health insurance. Your state of New Jersey, just in November, elected new members of Congress, Democrats, heavily Republican districts. Do you think voters in those districts want to see their private health insurance go away?
Well, I'm a pragmatist. I ran a city and had to try to bend the cost curve of health care. The way we're doing it right now doesn't work. Now, I say Medicare for all, but I'm also a person that's going to tell you in the next breath, we can't get there right away. We need to start showing first and foremost that we can create a viable public option just by reducing Medicare eligibility to 55. We were one vote away from doing that right before I came into the Senate. That alone would drive down costs. It would actually create lower costs for people that are in the private market because more older people would come into that public option. So there are really pragmatic steps we can take to accomplish our goals: expanding healthcare, lowering costs.
A few other things I want to ask you about. In your Justice for All plan, you've long worked on criminal justice issues. You want to give convicted felons the right to vote. As I'm sure you know, Senator Sanders has said they should not only have the right to vote when they're released from prison, they should have that right while they're incarcerated. Do you agree with him?
I just think that is a frustrating debate that we seem to now be having. As a guy who lives in the inner city black community and knows that there are millions of Americans that are being arrested and convicted and should never be there in the first, and not only lose their right to vote, but they lose their liberty. Let's get this conversation back to where it is right now. Our prison population in this country has gone up 500% since 1980 alone. We locked up more people for marijuana in 2017 than all the violent crimes combined. And so here we have a nation that takes away people's liberty and their right to vote for doing things that 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing. So if Bernie Sanders wants to get involved in the conversation about whether Dylann Roof and the marathon bomber should have the right to vote, my focus is liberating black and brown people and low-income people from prison, because we have a system in America, as Brian Stevenson says, it treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. My focus is tearing down the system of mass incarceration so that we don't even have to have the debate about people's voting rights because they're not going to prison in the first place. People that don't belong there are there, and I'm going to stop that as president.
Senator Cory Booker will be following you on the campaign trail.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And with that, let's bring in the analysis of our regular Politics Monday duo, Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report and host of Politics with Amy Walter on WNYC Radio, and Tamara Keith, White House correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics Podcast. Hello to both of you. It's Politics Monday. You just heard from one of the 20 candidates for the Democratic nomination. Amy, what's your reaction to what Cory Booker's saying?
You know, Cory Booker, it's really fascinating because he talked a lot in that interview with you about his time as a mayor and his time as an executive. But of course, now he's a senator. And there's another young mayor who's getting a whole lot of attention named Pete Buttigieg, right? And there's sometimes when I wonder how much it would be better sometimes for Cory Booker actually to be running as Mayor Booker when he was the mayor of Newark than as Senator Booker.
An outsider.
Being more of an outsider, exactly. And that he's no longer the shiny young mayor of this city that he talks a lot about the success he's had there. But there's also been a lot of criticism, a lot of it from the left, on how he governed and who he chose to partner with while he was an executive there, namely folks from Silicon Valley or finance, folks in the charter school movement. So he is, in many ways, has a similar path to what Pete Buttigieg has had, but he does not have the shine that Pete Buttigieg did, in part because now he's a part of Washington, and also because of all the time that the criticism has had to build up for his record as a mayor.
What do you make of his message?
Well, one thing that stood out is that he is, I think, trying to draw a contrast between himself and some of the other candidates, namely Joe Biden, by not going after President Trump in quite the same way. You know, he talked about, you know, some people want to fight fire with fire. I don't think we need to do that in this campaign. He has definitely chosen a different path, which is to be sort of a calming presence on the campaign trail, someone who, you know, his campaign launch video had the drummers, and it was all about, you know, America can be this great place where we come together and we have civic grace. And we watch him, and we're, of course, you know, we hate to come around to it, but we look at the polls. There are some out there about the candidates. Cory Booker is sharing 7th place. You don't even see him on these numbers we're putting up here from the Washington Post and ABC, Amy, but actually that's better than about a dozen of the other Democrats. And what's interesting here is that, yes, Joe Biden's at 13%, but no opinion, 47%. Joe Biden just rolled out, and granted this poll was wrapping up as he was announcing, but what does that say about what Democrats want?
One really important thing to know about this poll, especially when you're comparing it to other polls, they asked you, it's a so-called open-ended question, where they ask, who would you support for president? And then you have to put forward a name. They're not reading a list of names for you to say, oh, yes, I've heard of this person, I will support that person. So this is really literally for people who have enough knowledge about the field and who's running, and it gives an indication of where they are. But that also says to you, for somebody like Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders, who do have almost 100% name identification, they are not rolling off the top of people's tongues as, of course I want this person to serve as president. It is amazing to me, too, to think that this field could still be growing. I know, I can't believe it either, but
yes,
there are still a number of other high-profile, or at least high-level officials, Democratic officials, senators, and governors thinking about jumping in. So those two candidates, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, not really scaring anybody out of this race.
But Biden is in the race now, Tam, and are we getting an overwhelming sense of why he's running? Is his message coming through?
You know, he gave a speech today in Pittsburgh, and he did have 3 pillars to why he was running. The 3 pillars, and I'm going to get the words wrong here, and hopefully I'll remember all 3, but the 3 pillars were basically taking on President Trump and you know, returning America's reputation. The second was an economic message about rebuilding America's backbone, and the third was about bringing Americans together. So he came out, he had a stump speech. You know, the thing about Biden, he got into the race late compared to some of the other candidates, but he came out with a fully fledged campaign. He is immediately acting like a front runner in that he has a large staff and he had this big fundraising push, and he's coming out, you know, acting like a man running for president. At the same time, he's also continued to have to deal with questions, including about Anita Hill and how he handled that hearing all those years ago. And this is not going to be the last of the times that Joe Biden is going to have to answer questions about things that happened, you know, before some voters were ever born.
There was something about that speech today, too, in Pittsburgh. There was a nostalgia there for a time when Biden was first running, but also it sort of sounded like a Donald Trump speech in some ways, obviously very different, two very different people, but the focus on the backbone of America, America's middle class, the backbone of America here in Pennsylvania with these laborers and union members.
He's getting
These
a
are the
union
people
endorsement,
getting
right.
the union endorsement, basically going after those very people who have been defecting from the Democratic Party, not just to Donald Trump, but over the last 10 or 15 years have been moving more to the Republican side. But Donald Trump really captured a lot of those types of voters who felt like they had been left behind by the new economy and a Democratic Party that was obsessed with Silicon Valley and the coasts and not with them.
And just quickly, speaking of the economy, new economy, and I asked Cory Booker about this, Tam, Donald Trump is, at this point, he's got a good economy going into this election. What's the Democrats' return message?
Their return message is, and you heard it in Booker's interview, and you heard it from Democrats, they were speaking to union members this weekend. Their message is, the numbers may look good, but does it feel good right now? And the fact that Democrats are talking about a $15 minimum wage, that they're talking about child care expenses and college expenses, they're keying in, and prescription drug expenses, they're keying in on aspects of American life that make middle class people feel like the economy isn't reflected in the numbers that are really quite good.
Tamara Keith, Amy Walter, Politics Monday. Thank you.
You're welcome.